Around the world, politics has become a volatile topic. It feels to many that the policies of the parties are becoming more radical and no longer representing the will of the people. The question remains, are our elected officials doing what is best for us, the collective, or are they doing what's best for themselves? Tony Nikolic is a hard-working and accomplished civil and human rights lawyer and a criminologist. He is an advocate for whistleblower protection laws and has been speaking out against digital ID laws for over a decade. He has also been on the front lines fighting for Australians' rights as bills that will infringe upon those rights are being rammed through Parliament. He has appeared on countless podcasts, raising awareness of important bills that all Australians should be aware of. Welcome, Tony.
Oh, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate you taking time out of your very busy schedule to talk about all of these issues with me because I feel that these are incredibly important topics that Australians should be aware of, no matter which side of the fence they sort of fall on. It's something that they should at least know is happening in their country. So, before we get into all of that, can you just give us a little bit of your own background?
Well, sure. Look, born and raised here in Australia, actually in Darwin. Moved to Sydney a long time ago now, but I studied criminology, and from criminology, I worked in the enforcement with enforcement professionals, obviously the policing associations here in Australia with New South Wales Police in certain areas in intelligence, gathering data on drug and alcohol type figures and working closely with both state and federal police. And from there, I managed to get a law degree and um, opened up my own firm in or around 2021. And it just so happened that the impetus for me opening it up was I was fed up with the fact that no law firms were standing up to the dystopian measures that were being imposed upon Australian citizens, that being the COVID. And for me, it really meant a lot that everything that I've been fighting for over the years, and it dates back to, say, 2008, when I was writing my first articles about pharmaceutical frauds and false claims and how they've pretty well tapped into the public coffers or the taxpayers' purse. And in so doing, what we've actually seen over the last, say, 10, 15 years, especially since I've been writing that, my concern was the taxpayer dollars that have been depleted. And in that, I say we've privatised profits while socialising the costs. And I published a book chapter in 2014, which highlighted a lot of those issues. So for me, it really meant a lot. And when I seen COVID come up and I found out that no big law firms or anyone was really attacking it, I thought, well, when I was looking at the pain and suffering, especially in Victoria, that meant a lot to me, and someone had to stand up. And because I'd been doing it for well over 10 years, I thought, well, either step up or sit down. So that's really where it goes to. And I've been fighting those cases in the courts. Some have succeeded and some have not, obviously under the guise of a lot of controversy. So that's where that's been.
And before we get to the crux of this particular interview, because you've kind of over the last couple of years become really a political commentator in a lot of ways from the podcasts that I've watched, I was curious as to your thoughts about, from an outside observer, even though I am Australian, I'm living in the US currently, and watching what's going on in Australian politics, I feel as if I'm witnessing more than ever that bills are being rammed through Parliament without proper debate, without proper consultation. And it's really just what the politicians want to get through. And there is this very aggressive way of putting it through versus having the public be able to have their say or really give their feedback on it. Am I imagining that, or is that happening?
Well, you're not imagining it. It's absolutely right on point, as a matter of fact. See, Australia, along with a lot of other common law countries, although arguable whether that common law is actually applicable these days because of the positivist approach that the legal system has taken towards identifying and interpreting laws. But in terms of how they've been attacking this through Parliament, remember, we are a representative government, and those governments are supposed to represent the will of the people. Unfortunately, what we've seen is the governments representing the will of themselves with interested parties behind them. And that's where we are seeing these lobby groups really in the shadows or the halls of parliament pushing a lot of policies, and these ramming through these legislations as you referred to them. Ramrodding is what I call them, but we're right on point when it comes to the fact that they're just doing what they want. And the stark contrast to that with respect to political representation of the people is constituents are not being consulted. And a classic example of that was this. If you recall, the misinformation bill was put forward, and that misinformation bill pretty well articulated a certain part of, what they felt was going to happen. So what ended up happening there was this, is that Australians all over, and this was something that really appealed to me because I was really involved with this from, the get-go, especially with the international health regulations and those sorts of issues that were articulating. We need to censor, we need to control misinformation, disinformation. Well, misinformation, disinformation were just euphemisms for a mass censorship policy and control. But the thing that appealed to me was these NGOs, organisations such as the Australian Human Rights and places like that, they were really starting to stand up and put on submissions and say, this is not what we want here in Australia. Free speech should govern how we determine our future. And so essentially it was the battle of ideas, and you let the battle of ideas and the battle of free speech. So if I was to say something ludicrous, such as, look at these unicorns flying around, well, we don't need to censor me. All you needed to do is bring people with evidence and say, well, hang on a second, show me the evidence. And this is the battle of ideas. Now, I made a very stark example there, but I was just trying to put that forward. But these submissions came out, and there was not one expert that cited, well, perhaps those submissions have come out since, but most of the experts, if not all, actually went against the misinformation bill. What did we see in the next one? In this under 16s social media ban bill, they gave people 24 hours to make a submission. Okay. So this went against that representative governance. So therefore, constituents were locked out. I can tell you right now that I was lobbying pretty hard, and I was getting senators. So we're sitting Australian senators and parliamentarians who I was writing to, and I was putting out mass mail outs to every single one of them saying, don't do this because it goes against the very heart of our constitution, not only the heart of our constitution, but the very essence of our democracy. The very essence of our democracy is free speech and allowing people to contribute. And they give us 24 hours to make a submission. Now, my view on that is this, is that they did that because they knew they were going to get trounced again like they did in the misinformation bill. They knew that the people didn't want it. So what happened? Two major parties here in Australia, both the Liberal and Labor, ramrodded these laws through. And as a consequence, a social media ban bill was passed, and now that has been effectually in law. And that is a really big concern, because I think if we know about salami slicing, they'll start it there and then move it down the track. And I think that's our biggest concern. And we are moving towards this totalitarian slash dystopian type society where there's a shift towards centralized government. And that shift towards centralized government is dangerous. That is not who we are as a country, and no free democratic society in the world should stand for it. And Australian people really need to wake up, because, showing up to their local barbecue or, football game is not as important as what's happening right now.
When you were talking about freedom and freedom of speech, in my head, I kept hearing the national anthem for "We Are Young and Free." And it does feel, looking at the laws that they're trying to pass, that the walls are really closing in and stopping people from having that freedom. And in the mis and disinformation bill, and please correct me if I am wrong, but while they wanted to penalise everyday Australians for just having an opinion, doctors for going against whatever the medical advice is, and if we go back to COVID times and you go to the beginning when people were speaking out against the narrative that was out at the time, if it wasn't for them speaking out, we wouldn't have had the disclosures over the last couple of years that we have of what actually was going on versus what we were being told. It was the pressure from people speaking out and speaking against this narrative that sort of got us to this point where
Yeah,
we are seeing the studies and everything that people were calling for that should have been available originally. But in this mis and disinformation bill, the Australian politicians were all going to be protected and have complete freedom of speech while nobody else did. Is that correct?
absolutely correct. One of the most pertinent points, and I think if I can just touch on what you raised there, which is absolutely wonderful, is the fact that it wasn't just medical, but also financial information. And the medical information, in this sense, they were going to be given carte blanche, so they could say whatever they want. They could put out anything they wanted. And as a consequence, anyone that came close to questioning that was in dire trouble of potentially breaching some sort of an act. The other side of the coin was the financial information. If they deemed that anyone talking about financial information may undermine the confidence in the financial system, well, that just smacks in the face of concealment, doesn't it? Both of those. And during the course of 221, as everyone may know, or whether they don't, is I was the first lawyer in Australia to run the Kassam case. Now, it was dismissed, and that challenged the powers of a minister to grant mandates and lockdowns. But through that, we presented so much evidence coming from, especially US experts and Australian experts and European experts. So I put this evidence before the court, and that included evidence of a coronial pathologist report of someone who said within the last 7 days of someone receiving a vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine, this person had subsequently had a heart attack and died in front of his family with his son trying to do CPR on him, and mother hysterically crying in the background. This is evidence that we put there. And one of the most significant, well, a couple of significant points is that during that case, it was actually acknowledged there and then, 12 months before it came out in the European Parliament. If you remember Robert Roos questioning the Pfizer representative in European Parliament, and there was this big hoo-ha about Pfizer acknowledging that it didn't stop transmission. That first came out in Kassam a year earlier, where the state expert, Professor Christine McCartney, acknowledged that it didn't stop transmission. So the logic was this: well, if it doesn't stop if it doesn't stop transmission, doesn't confer immunity, it's not going to stop the hospitalizations, it's not going to stop the deaths, right? So there was no need for the mandates on the lockdowns, but they still went against us. But the important point raised, that I'm touching on, your very important point there, was this information was coming out, and it was actually enlightening the public, saying that yes, we were right, and the evidence was on par. As a matter of fact, the evidence is showing a much more egregious, almost conspiratorial global type crime that has occurred. And we are certainly establishing that as we go along, because there are many elements to this and there are many governments involved. And for that to occur, well, there are a lot of issues that go on. But back to Professor Christine McCartney, very noble professor, but in the resume during cross-examination, we found out that she had received $65 million in grants doing research on vaccines and other types of medications. So that was extremely relevant. And again, so what? The issues from the courts were, so what? We don't care. So what? I also raised the fact that Australia's Bill of Rights. Well, we don't have a Bill of Rights. Let's move on. Well, what about the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights? Doesn't apply. Doesn't apply here in Australia. But when they want to reply to it or apply it, they will use it. But when we want to do it, what I actually did in that case was showed what we really didn't have here in Australia. It was all a facade. It was a puppet show, okay, of you have human rights, you have civil. We don't, okay, and that was confirmed in this case. But here's the cracker. There was one Dr. Brian Tyson, and he's from San Diego. A lovely guy. In addition to Jay Bhattacharya, who I'll get to in a moment, and we all know Professor Jay Bhattacharya, he's such a lovely guy, and God bless him, because he's hopefully he's up there working with Robert Kennedy Jr. So, but in Brian Tyson's evidence that we put to the court, we showed at that point that there were something like 5,994 people that he had treated at that point in time. And of them, I think 6 people had passed away because they had advanced stages of COVID. and they were pretty well moving along. But and it was sad to see that was the case. But what was important there, he demonstrated at that point in time there was no difference between the vaccinated and the unvaccinated. So what was the logic behind the lockdowns? Okay. There was no logic. There was no logic. This was just made up. It was guesswork by governments and public health people. Then we've seen the dystopian style of policing where they were brutally beating people up on the streets. A young lady walking on the streets of Melbourne was picked up by her throat and slammed to the ground for not having a mask. I think we've all seen that footage, and that was dire. I represented many people, and most of them succeeded here, if not all, as a matter of fact, when we challenged the police. And that's the sort of issues, and I'm still fighting in those cases today, and this is many years on. But with Jay Bhattacharya's evidence, he was remarkable in his evidence. He actually noted that children were almost at a zero or a nil chance of dying from COVID, and yet they were putting these onto children. They were locking people down. They were mandating it. And so in our evidence, when we were opening up we took on a case here to open up the churches and the synagogues. And in that case, Jay Bhattacharya provided evidence with respect to the epidemiological aspect of it. And what we couldn't understand, and again, this goes to that logic, where you could go to buy liquor and alcohol, you could go to a brothel, but you couldn't go to church. And we were trying to establish how that was. We had patrons in car parks sitting in their cars wanting to listen to a sermon in their cars with a car spot in between. And they said, no, you're not allowed to do this. This had nothing to do with the virus. It was all about control. I'm maintaining that. I'm going to maintain that. And I think what we're going to see as time goes on is that these were ridiculous policies. I think Mr. Fauci over there is going to have some problems in the USA. And I think there are other people, we won't get into that just yet, but there are other people who are implicated.
This is a conversation we could have for the next few hours, but I'm going to move on to one of the other bills that's going on in Australia. And this is the digital ID laws. So before we really get into that, I want to know, because you've been talking about digital ID for well over a decade, what first alerted you to digital ID and it being a problem?
Well, digital ID actually centralises information. And here in Australia, we've got this Trust Exchange digital ID program. And what it does, it's seeking to consolidate information and verification into these government control systems. Now, look, before anyone says anything, I'm not anti-government. I'm not anti-corp. I'm not. I'm all for balance, free speech, rights, and liberty. That's what I'm about. Okay. There needs to be a good balance here. So, what have we got? Privacy risks. So, centralized databases. Okay. These are controlled by certain entities, usually government, and somewhere down the track, and we know this particularly here in Australia, they'll sell it off to a private organisation. Okay. It'll start government based and they'll sell it off to a private organisation. Next thing things are, you're losing things and you can't access stuff. And they're going to say, well, you know what? Sorry, but can you prove that that damage that you suffered was from us? Okay. And now you've got this little person. Okay. So the common person is having to take on these multinational corporations and prove by virtue of damage legally. It's almost impossible, put it that way, to do that. Why? Because they're going to have to do that. So there's those data breaches and state surveillance abuses. They can get into a lot of this stuff. Okay, so we got that. And then you also have these issues of control over services where the government, they can restrict access to banking. Okay, they can restrict access to healthcare, travel, and why should that ever be something that should be in the government's power? And then the other one is the potential for expansion. Okay, so this is where they're going to start, and this is why I talk about the salami slicing type event. And so the digital ID, they start as a voluntary process. This is all good for you. This is for you, and we're making life easier. But the concerns here, they're not just theoretical. They're played out in other nations and authoritarian overreach in other countries. We've seen it play out in India. And as a consequence of what happened in India, those laws were struck down because they said you should not get involved with private citizens and whether they can get into banking and healthcare. You should not be involved in that. If someone wants to contribute, they can get involved. Absolutely voluntary, but we all know what they meant by voluntary with the COVID vaccine too. They said it was voluntary, but here in Australia you couldn't do anything and you were pretty well being coerced, and some people say forced to do things because you lost your job. So here in Australia, the issue of voluntary is very suspicious and really raises a lot of concerns.
I think the word voluntary, like many other words over the last 5 years, the definition changed. It became a fluid definition depending on who was using it and in what circumstance. So when I've been learning about digital ID, there are several things which come to mind. One of them being when you go to the Australian government website and read about digital ID laws and what they are implementing, it's all voluntary. One of the words that keeps coming up. And I'll get to the voluntary part a little bit later on. But they talk about how it will protect people from data breaches. But the reality is, if everything is online, we have seen time and again, and even just in the last 6 months, massive data breaches over here in the US. I mean, there was a period of time for a couple of months where casinos in Las Vegas went dark because some of these huge corporations were hacked. We don't know if they were being held to ransom or what was going on.
Mhm.
Hospitals have had their systems shut down for the same reasons. And there's nothing from my point of view that would say that the same things wouldn't happen to the government, despite them saying that it's a safer way to prove your ID versus having to provide a birth certificate, a license, and a passport. Am I crazy for thinking that?
Not at all. Let me give you some clearer examples, and you're right on point, by the way, and bless you for thinking down that line, because if you look at this China social credit score system, okay, they've got this system in place. It started in a very similar fashion to where a lot of that sort of stuff happened, and what ended up happening? Well, people. You got travel bans. If you had a low score, you were shut out of banking. Employment restrictions, and you also had exclusion from other areas of just normal private life. And why was that the case? Well, that's because your social credit score was lower than someone else's. And who judged that? It was the government. And the government did that because if you didn't comply with their way of thinking, that reduced your score. Okay. And that is the danger here. Now, I spoke a moment ago about India, and I think it's a great example because there were mass exclusion. Now, that was the ADHR, it was AADHAAR digital ID system, and that was a biometric based ID system. Okay. Now, what they did was they made it mandatory for banking and all that sort of stuff. Okay. But what ended up doing, it excluded millions of people. Okay, because some people don't have tech, some people can't get involved with tech, some people just don't, and it excluded so many people. Secondly, the breaches, there were privacy breaches here. And what we had was sensitive personal data being leaked. And now whether they were hacked or leaked, doesn't matter. Your information's out there. Now, one concern I've always had is if your biometrics go, okay, that's your fingerprints and your iris, okay, you can't change that. You can change your password. Okay. You can change, whether you put a hashtag here, a dollar sign, a percentage sign, one, two, capital letter, a smiley face, do whatever you want. You can change that. It gets hacked, you change it. You cannot change your iris. You can't change your biometrics. And that is a really big concern. So all this stuff went before the courts, and the Supreme Court in India knocked it back and said, do not make it mandatory. There should be absolutely no reason for this to be mandatory. And we've seen that in other countries such as Jamaica and a couple of other countries like that. So I strongly suspect that as this goes on, there'll be further roles to play in that area. But data breaches are a significant issue. And we've seen here in Australia the Optus. So Optus is a telecommunications carrier, massive data breach.
I do remember the Optus breach, and I was glad that I was no longer with them. So the whole tying together of medical records and digital ID in Australia, which again currently is voluntary, but is, in your opinion, is the reason they're trying to tie it together for that biometric data which would in turn turn it into a social credit score system.
Yes, because I think what's critical here is that this isn't a one-off event, and it's not an Australia thing. We got to take this back. There's the international health regulations, okay? So the international health regulations are also written about this in the Australian media here. There are certification processes for you, and the 2024 amendments pretty well make that important. So while the intent was to ensure accurate information dissemination during public health crises and things like that, there was a lack of clear definitions. So issues such as, how that information is imparted, what parts information, what parts misinformation, what parts disinformation. So all these aspects came into it. So you had that, and you also had these issues of um, uh, these global entities, so NGOs, they're not even governments, and they're trying to tell governments this is what we want to see from your country, and these governments are just coming into it. And so this is the potential. What we can see here is that if you're unvaccinated, you're going to be restricted from traveling. You can't go somewhere. And that's your health decisions. Let's say you missed a payment somewhere, and who knows, it could be your last electricity bill and it's just an inadvertent error. Well, now everything's blocked. You're stuck. You could be, traversing Mount Kilimanjaro and you need to pay a bill on your iPay, and you won't be able to do it. So why? Because everything's blocked. So I know people may look and say, oh, that's not going to happen. Well, they also said that with COVID. Okay, it's not going to happen. Well, it will, and that's exactly where they're going. And you can see with the international issue, well, the takeaway is the international frameworks, while designed to promote transparency, can paradoxically create an opaque system of control. Okay, and this is where governments manipulate regulations to suppress dissent rather than uphold public trust and embrace freedom and liberty. This is the issue we need to face, and that's where we are right now.
This whole thing around it being voluntary is really interesting to me because even though currently, if you go to any of the Australian government websites where they are talking about the digital ID and the digital ID bill, it keeps saying voluntary, voluntary, voluntary. Everywhere you go, it says it's voluntary. But I have received phone calls from numerous people just over the last week where people have tried to pay their tax online, and it was a requirement that they use digital ID. They had a moment, were reaching out to their accountants to see if there was another option for it. I followed up with that person and said, what happened? And there was a resolution there, but they never got the answer as to whether it could be resolved without digital ID because it was a more complicated response. Then I was told about a story of another person who cannot access their group certificate for the financial year without digital ID. So there is already this element of it not being voluntary.
Yeah, absolutely. It was like, and again, I know that the parallel here really, I know we keep going back to COVID, but the parallel is COVID, where it was perceivably voluntary, but if you don't do it, you can't access things. And so, if you recall, I'll go back and I'll come back to your point in a moment. But if you go back to the vaccines, remember you couldn't go outside of 5 kilometers. It's okay, you don't need the vaccine, but you can't go to work. You can't go outside 5 kilometers or 3 miles or 3.1 miles, whatever it is. Um, and you couldn't go to pubs, clubs, you couldn't go to weddings, you couldn't visit your relatives in a nursing home, your mother or your grandfather or whatever. And that was voluntary, remember? And they said, well, you do have informed consent. You can give informed consent or you don't, but you just don't get to contribute. And that's exactly what's happening here. You can't pay your bills. You won't be able to pay your tax. And if you can't pay your tax because you don't have a digital ID, then the Australian Tax Office, or the IRS as they're called in the USA, well, they can fine you and then they can impose further sanctions. And so you get trapped in this cycle of sanctions whereby you not contributing really has got nothing to do with voluntariness. It's got to do with a dystopian arbitrariness, okay? And it almost harks back to the feudalist days, doesn't it? Where you must do as the king says, or this is going to happen to you, okay?
I'm going to move on just because of time that we have available to us. And I have to read this next question because I don't want to misquote or misrepresent what I'm about to say. But you are the director of the Australian Taxpayers Against Fraud and False Claims. So, first of all, I Googled this before we got online to have this conversation. And AI said that Australian Taxpayers Against Fraud and False Claims would likely refer to a hypothetical group or movement combating fraudulent or false claims made to the ATO. So, is this a hypothetical organization that you're a part of?
Well, it's not hypothetical. I'm here. And if I could just excuse me, I'll just turn my back for 1 second here. Um, there's the book chapter I wrote, and if I go to, so it's not hypothetical, is what I'm trying to say. Look at that. Can you read that?
Yes, I can. So, do you want me to actually read it out loud?
Oh yeah, yeah,
Out
go
loud?
if you can.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, because they have evidence globalizing financial incentives for corporate fraud whistleblowers.
Okay, so the essence behind that is this, is that the public coffers, they belong to the taxpayer. It is not government money. Okay, it is taxpayer money. So we're seeing all this stuff about DOGE and all that sort of stuff. I've been fighting this for so long. And the reason being is this, is that I could see, as I said in the introduction, is that one of the best business models, and I call them fraudulent business models, is because we've been conned as taxpayers to accept these subsidies. Now, don't get me wrong, subsidies can be good in some areas, okay? Especially, if you're looking at healthcare and needy services, I'm all for that, okay? But don't rip it off. And some of those rip-offs, or like I call, um, it's where you privatize the profits, but you socialize the costs. And so what do we do here? Let me give you a classic example. You make medication A, you tell everyone medication A is the best thing. It stops this virus, okay? And it stops it, man. And as time goes on, we realize it did not do jack, okay? And as a consequence, the taxpayers paid out billions of dollars globally on this supposed magic potion, and it did nothing. Well, the taxpayers have been issued a false claim. Am I right? Those taxpayers should be able to redeem every and each one of those payments. Now, in the USA, the purpose of what I wrote here, see, in the USA, there was a law, and it's called the False Claims Act, and brought in during um, Abraham Lincoln's days. Okay, now the False Claims Act is very important because it provides penalties for people who make false claims against the US taxpayer. I wanted to bring that here, and I was working with the Australian National University, the late Professor Tom Faunce, Faculty of Law and Medicine. And we were looking at all this stuff, and we were actually meeting with Australian Federal Police and all that sort of a long time ago to try and bring these in. So it's very important that we understand, as whether we're US or Australians or UK, the taxpayer funds, it's not government money. We've lost this. And where they say, well, we're paying this much to send these many arms to Ukraine. Well, did you consult the taxpayer? Because remember, you're holding that on trust legally. You're holding that on trust for the taxpayer to say, these are the services we have. We need to pay this. What's happening here in Australia, and as we've identified in the USA with Elon Musk and Trump and that administration, well, they've identified something that is absolutely relevant to where we are today. We have people living in tents. We have mothers with children sleeping in the back of cars. Okay, and they move everything out of the back of the car. They hide it under the car so they can all sleep in the back of the car. And in the morning, they get up, they pack that car up, put it back in, and go somewhere else, right? And then we have these, well, I don't call them leaders because they're representatives. They are only representatives, okay? I don't take it so high as to put them as leaders, and I say that with the greatest respect because they are political representatives, and that's where they're at. So the issue here is this, is that money needs to be spent on Australians and Australian citizens, okay? First, okay? Now, I'm all for national defence and the military. I'm all for that. I'm all for having security, but I'm not for putting so much security in the sense of digital ID, surveillance, cameras everywhere, and catering to arms sales overseas, of which the The leader of Ukraine himself says we don't know where half of it is. Okay. So where's the auditing? Okay. And so if we're going to globalize this, we need to understand where is our money going and how is that money being spent. Now, if we've got Australians and Americans and them living on the streets, and I remember in 2019 when I was in San Diego, there meeting some of the people there from the Innocence Project at the San Diego University, the people living on the streets. And look, I used to live in LA. It used to be such a beautiful place, and now I'm seeing tents on the side of the road. I'm seeing tents along the Brisbane River here in Australia, seeing people here. We've got mothers, escaping domestic violence with kids living out of cars. That money can be spent here. That money can be spent on the US citizen. And this is why I'm so passionate about what I do, because I'm seeing kids, and every now and then I'll go out to somewhere and I'll find a family who's experienced or trying to get out of domestic violence, and I'll take their kids out on a go-karting session and I'll pay for it out of my pocket with the mother, and I'll just say, here's your day out. Let's go. And the two young boys or whatever it is, and they have the best day out. Why? Because we're not doing it. They're leaving it up to the citizen. So the citizen's paying twice. But at the same time, multinationals are tapping into the coffers of the public treasury. That's our money. Okay. And they're getting these subsidized programs over the line through Parliament who just approve everything. They get all the billions and the taxpayer gets left with the costs. That's not fair. And that needs to change.
On the homelessness issue, it's something I've been very interested in for a very long period of time. I did some work with the Period Project in Melbourne. I was their ambassador while I was still living in Australia, doing incredible work and helping homeless women to have the menstrual products that they need so that they don't need to steal the things that they can't afford, but they don't have a choice regarding. But living in LA, and especially through 2020, 2021, at the end of my street, and I live in a great part of LA, I had not homeless people on the street, but an encampment at the end of the street that we had 3 or 4 murders happen there in the time that they were allowed to be there. And I'm not anti-homeless people because I understand that these people are in a position that is sort of beyond their control in a lot of circumstances. There are obviously people that choose to live this nomadic life because they don't want to adhere to the rules of society. That's a separate conversation. But there are plenty of people that do not want to be in that position and are because they cannot get out of this cycle. So starting to research it, there are plenty of people that work in the homelessness sector that talk about the money laundering that goes on and that it's an issue that nobody wants to solve, because if they solve it, then the money stops coming in to the NGOs and other organizations. And so it is taxpayer money going around and around and around. And then when citizens stand up and give their own money to help people individually or to smaller organizations that are actually doing good work, like you said, we are paying twice. I understand that DOGE is very controversial, and it's fascinating watching both sides of politics over here. One side is cheering Elon and the Trump government on for exposing what's going on and stopping the expenditures that have been going out to ridiculous causes. And then the other side of the aisle is upset that he's doing it, but not upset at the fraud and waste that's going on. So do you think that Australia will ever see something like DOGE implemented within the government the way we're seeing it play out over here in the US?
I think with enough pressure, yes. And the only reason it's happening in the US is through pressure. And I think whatever opinion one may have of Donald J. Trump, Elon Musk, and the administration over there, the intent is good. Okay. And it's good because they're saying, where is the waste? And, if that's upsetting people, then I need to try and ask or ascertain, well, why is that good for you to say, you're opposing it because it also implies concealment, and concealment is the way forward. And that's not the way forward. What we need to do is push it out. We need to purge out all the wasteful spending. If there's a military project overseas and it's leading to some sort of money laundering campaign, well, we have a right to know. Okay. Not only should we know, we should have a right to know. And it's not, national security because it's taxpayer dollars. Now, in that sense, what we're seeing in the US administration is something very effective that I've been combating now for many, many years. And I'm really sort of pleased because I'm starting to see the issues are coming to the fore, and now people are really talking about it. For me, it's been a long, hard trot, but it's not worthless because what we're actually fighting for is something good. It's something good. It's not bad. And we should all do that because if we can identify that, then our cost of living goes down, our groceries go down, we get people into homes, we help the homeless where we can, because some people, and look, I worked in the enforcement and youth off the streets Catholic program down here, assisting young children who are going, off the beaten track and getting in trouble with the law. And I assist, and some people you can't help, but why can't we put in these systems? Because people are losing mortgages and they're losing their homes. Why? Because of poor spending. Okay. The government's not spending their money because they're giving themselves pay rises every couple of months. And yet pay rises for the normal citizen isn't keeping up with inflation, and inflation is created by government spending. So this is ridiculous, okay? We don't need to get into these programs, and we could see in the USA some of the programs that DEI programs in countries, and this is ridiculous. We should not be imposing ourselves on these issues. We should be focusing on our country. What is it to make this country great? And if we can do that, then we can create surpluses, and those surpluses can then be used to assist others. And I think we need to come back to that line of thinking and not just spit out money. And the issues with respect to what is happening in the USA also includes Donald Trump's administration bringing back manufacturing. Okay, Australia has done a very poor job of this over the last, say, 30, 40 years. We outsource all our minerals and manufacturing. So we sell it to them pennies on the dollar and we buy it back in hundreds of dollars. That is almost ridiculous, ridiculous public policy because we could enrich ourselves. Australia is such a resource-rich country in many aspects. Oil, water, minerals, metals. It's got everything. But you know what we don't have? We don't have people with brains sitting in Canberra. That's what we lack.
Yeah, the political landscape is a little bit stark. There are some incredible voices in Parliament, but unfortunately they are few and far between. So the final question I wanted to ask you, what is something that all Australians should be aware of that's happening in politics at the moment that, in your opinion, isn't getting enough coverage?
Uh, that certainly is one. There is the waste of taxpayer dollars, increasing the cost of living, and it's imposing itself upon each person daily. And that pressure is putting itself on the community to such an extent that we're seeing people lose homes. Again, we've just touched on that. But another issue is the censorship through the media and social media is creating an idea where these politicians are just creating rules for themselves and they're passing laws and they're doing these mandate things for our safety, but they're not. They're actually centralizing power. And so what we need to do is we need to get back to this essence of representative participatory democracy. That's what we need to do.
I said that was the last question, but I have one more. What would be the best way, in your opinion? Because there are a lot of people that say it's too hard, it's too complicated. Even researching these bills that they've been trying to ram through Parliament, it's difficult, it's confusing. You try and read the bills, the wording is horrendous. Social media is a bit of a landmine that we're sort of waiting to step on because there is a lot of misinformation out there where people who aren't informed are posting things and then it goes viral. So, what would be the best way for somebody who wants to be aware of what's going on, who's maybe not educating themselves currently, for them to find out exactly what's going on so that they have a better understanding and can then find a way to get involved?
Okay, there's a couple parts of that, and I'll try and summarize as best as I can. The issue is this, is that the politicians don't know, okay? And if they don't know, no one knows. And the reason I say that is this is because I have emails from senators who are sitting senators right now, and especially during these bills. And they were, I think it was 32 bills I counted at the last tranche when the under 16, 32 bills were passed in 24 hours. They were actually concerned because they did not have time to read those 32 bills. If they don't have those 32 bills and both major parties gang up and ram those bills through, we discussed this, and they ram them through, well, laws are being passed without that consultation representative process that we're talking about. That is a big concern because we need to get on top of that, and we need to get on top of it very quickly. So one of the issues is if they don't know and they're emailing me, how is anyone else going to know? And as a lawyer, I read these bills too, and I go, where is this going? Like, there's no definitions. They're not clarifying certain points. Where's the second reading? Okay, you got the second reading, but was it put through a consultation? Well, it wasn't put through a consultation process because they've given everyone 32 bills in 24 hours. Well, they're major concerns. So in terms of how we break through, well, unfortunately, what they're doing is like a blitzkrieg. And it's like COVID and the measures with COVID and the blitzkrieg. They push this on you and they create this emergency. And people are literally in this like a deer in the headlights type thing going, what's first? What's first? What's most important? And by the time we get to one, we're already down the road. The best metaphor to describe that is by the time you feel the rain, the cloud's a mile away. And that's right now. So what we need to do, in my view, is to look at the solution, and the solution to it is let's get back to that participatory democracy level where they actually act as representatives of the people and not of themselves.
Well, Tony, thank you so much for this conversation. It's been enlightening, and I think these are really important topics that Australians need to be focusing on. I will have all of your information in the description below so people can find you. Your Instagram is a great source of information. So if you're watching, make sure you go and check that out and give Tony a follow. Thank you so much, and I look forward to more conversations with you in the future.
Can I just say one thing on Instagram? I'm being heavily shadow banned. Please share, 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 because that's what gets it out. Obviously, Mr. Zuckerberg thinks that my information is so good that it must be silenced. So that's that. But you can also see me on Twitter, Tony Nikolic 10, and that's also getting quite a bit of traction there too. Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it. And say hello to everyone in the USA. I used to live there and I love the place. If anything, that's my second home. I love it.
I absolutely will. Thank you so much.